The Peace of Geneva didn't collapse in a shouting match. It collapsed in silence. Inside the conference suites of the Intercontinental Hotel Geneva, Iranian diplomats presented what they described as a historic 78-point roadmap towards stabilization. The document was thick, structured, carefully worded, every paragraph wrapped in language designed to signal compromise. 78 points. That number alone was strategic. Pressure campaigns running parallel to negotiations will not accelerate concessions. They will stall them. But here's the larger implication. If talks stall, the alternatives narrow. More sanctions, more cyber retaliation, more maritime tension, more regional proxy friction. Each layer compounds volatility, and markets notice, energy traders notice, regional governments notice, because instability in the Gulf doesn't stay regional for long. The global calculation. This is not simply a bilateral dispute. It is a test case. Can diplomacy survive in a world where cyber operations, sanctions enforcement, and covert economic maneuvers unfold simultaneously? Or does every negotiation now require simultaneous de-escalation across multiple invisible domains? That is the deeper story of Geneva. The 78 points were not rejected because they were too short. They were rejected because Washington believed they were incomplete, and possibly misaligned with actions unfolding elsewhere. What happens next? The immediate question is whether both sides recalibrate. Will Iran revise sequencing? Will Washington soften preconditions? Or will both sides escalate leverage to strengthen bargaining positions? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When talks collapse publicly, leverage often increases privately, and the world rarely sees those moves until after they've already reshaped the board. Final reflection. The so-called 78 standoff is not about bullet points. It's about trust in a multi-domain environment. It's about whether diplomacy can function when cyber alerts flash red during negotiation sessions. It's about whether sanctions relief precedes compliance, or follows it. Inside that Geneva hotel, two philosophies collided. Engagement with phased compliance versus dismantlement before reward. Neither side blinked, and until one does, the wall of skepticism remains. If you believe this standoff pushes the region toward stabilization, or toward escalation, share your perspective below. Because what happens after Geneva may not unfold in conference rooms, it may unfold in code, in shipping manifests, in intelligence briefings, and by the time the next handshake happens, the board may already look completely different. Let's strip away diplomacy for a moment, because physics does not negotiate. At the core of this standoff is uranium enrichment, and the reality that enrichment is not linear. Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity at both the Fordo fuel enrichment plant and the Natanz nuclear facility. That number matters. Natural uranium contains about 7% U-235, the fissile isotope required for nuclear fuel and weapons. Low-enriched uranium used for civilian reactors sits around 35%. Weapons-grade uranium is typically around 90%. Here's what most people misunderstand. The jump from 7% to 5% is difficult. The jump from 5% to 20% is harder. The jump from 20% to 60% is exponentially more complex. But once a program reaches 60%, the remaining climb to 90% is significantly faster, because the majority of the separative work has already been completed. Enrichment is about reducing mass while increasing concentration. The higher you go, the less material you're working with, and the quicker it can be refined further. That is why 60% is often described as weapons adjacent, not because it is weapons grade, but because the hardest engineering phase is already behind you. What suspension actually means. Iran's proposal uses the word suspend. In political language, that sounds meaningful. In engineering terms, it isn't. Centrifuge cascades are intricate systems of high-speed rotors spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. They are calibrated for precise isotope separation. When enrichment is paused, the machines do not disappear. The rotors remain installed. The cascade configuration remains intact. The feed and withdrawal systems remain connected. The vacuum pumps, the power systems, the cascade halls all remain in place. Restarting enrichment under those conditions is not a months-long industrial rebuild. It is an operational decision. For Washington, that distinction is everything. A pause preserves capability. Dismantlement removes it. The gold standard? Physical destruction. The U.S. position, as reflected in previous arms control models, is rooted in irreversibility. Not sealing, not storage, destruction. Rotor assemblies are delicate precision components. If physically destroyed, replacing them requires manufacturing capacity, time, and detectable procurement chains. If simply disconnected and stored, they can be reinstalled rapidly. This is the difference between reversible and irreversible compliance. Under the framework of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, centrifuge numbers were limited and excess units were placed under monitoring, not destroyed outright. Critics argued that approach preserved breakout capability. Supporters argued it extended breakout timelines sufficiently for detection and response. The current dispute goes further. Washington reportedly wants dismantlement that cannot be undone quietly. Iran has refused to even entertain that conversation, and that refusal alone reshapes the negotiating table. The command, anytime, anywhere. The second pillar is access. Under the JCPOA framework, the International Atomic Energy Agency had enhanced access to declared facilities. Inspectors could monitor known enrichment sites. But access to military facilities, particularly those controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, remained highly sensitive and politically constrained. The IRGC oversees ballistic missile development. It manages portions of Iran's underground bunker network. It controls segments of infrastructure that blur the line between military and nuclear research. Washington's demand for anytime, anywhere inspection authority aims to eliminate sanctuary. The logic is straightforward. If inspectors cannot enter a site on short notice, that site becomes a potential blind spot. Iran's counterargument is equally straightforward. Unrestricted military access equals intelligence penetration. From Tehran's perspective, inspection rights that extend into IRGC facilities are not verification measures. They are strategic vulnerability, and that is where the trust deficit becomes visible. Verification demands transparency. Sovereignty resists intrusion. Neither side sees the issue as technical. Both see it as existential. The technology, environmental sampling. Now we move into the most advanced layer of verification. Environmental sampling is not science fiction. It is already used by nuclear watchdogs worldwide. But the scale being discussed here is far more intrusive. Atmospheric sampling systems can detect microscopic traces of enriched uranium particles. Even if released inadvertently through ventilation systems or minor containment leaks, isotopic signatures linger, they travel, they settle. Advanced modeling can trace particle drift patterns backward toward origin points. In principle, this means covert enrichment leaves forensic footprints, even if conducted underground, even if shielded from satellites. The sensitivity levels being discussed, parts per quadrillion, are astonishing. But the political implications are even more explosive. Deploying a dense sensor network capable of constant atmospheric analysis does more than detect enrichment. It maps infrastructure. It identifies airflows. It reveals construction patterns. Over time, it builds a layered geospatial intelligence profile. Iran's leadership has described this as espionage infrastructure. From a purely technical standpoint, they are not entirely wrong. Verification systems collect data. Data reveals patterns. Patterns expose networks. And in a region defined by secrecy and layered deterrence, that level of transparency is strategically destabilizing. The unbridgeable gap. So here is the core divide. The United States is demanding physics-level irreversibility and network-level transparency. Iran is offering monitoring at declared sites and suspension of expansion. One side seeks dismantlement. The other offers delay. One side seeks structural rollback. The other offers conditional pause. That gap is not resolved through wording adjustments. It is resolved through political concession, and at the moment, neither side appears willing to concede. Why this matters beyond Iran. This dispute extends beyond a single nuclear program. It sets precedent. If a country can enrich to 60%, preserve infrastructure intact, and negotiate sanctions relief without dismantlement, that becomes a template. Other regional actors watch closely. Verification standards shape future proliferation dynamics. Arms control is built on precedent. Lower the bar once, and it stays lowered. Raise it, and enforcement becomes harder, but deterrence becomes clearer. That is why Washington is pushing for irreversibility, not simply for this agreement, but for what it signals globally, the strategic reality. Here is the uncomfortable truth on both sides. Iran has already achieved technical mastery of advanced centrifuge operation. Destroying hardware does not erase knowledge. Rebuilding would take time, but not erase capability. At the same time, allowing hardware to remain intact preserves rapid breakout potential. So negotiations revolve around time. Breakout time, detection time, response time. Diplomacy, at its core, is buying time. The United States wants to maximize it. Iran wants to minimize constraints while gaining economic relief. That is the strategic tug-of-war. The endgame question. If neither side moves, the alternatives narrow. Continued sanctions pressure, expanded regional deterrence posture, covert disruption efforts, cyber escalation, or eventually renewed negotiation under altered leverage. But here is what cannot be negotiated. Physics. Centrifuge cascades either exist intact or they don't. Rotor assemblies are either destroyed or they're not. Sensors are either deployed or they aren't. Verification either penetrates military facilities or it stops at the gate. These are binary realities, and binary realities are difficult to compromise. The Geneva talks did not collapse because of a misunderstanding. They stalled because one side demanded irreversible change, and the other offered reversible compliance. Until that asymmetry is resolved, the 78-point framework remains exactly what critics describe it as: optics without structural surrender. Whether that changes depends not on rhetoric, but on hardware. And hardware does not respond to persuasion. It responds to force, political, economic, or otherwise. There are moments in geopolitics when diplomacy fails quietly, and then there are moments when it fails with consequences. Tonight, in Geneva, the room is silent, not because agreement has been reached, but because the gap between the United States and Iran is no longer political. It is physical, it is technological, and it may soon become military. What is unfolding right now is not simply another round of nuclear talks. It is a collision between verification and sovereignty, between physics and power, and between deterrence and enforcement. And hanging over everything is something analysts are calling the 10-day clock. The physics. Centrifuge irreversibility. Let's begin where the Americans began, with physics. Iran has enriched uranium to 60% purity at its Fordow and Natanz facilities. 90% is considered weapons grade. But here's the part most headlines ignore. The jump from 60% to 90% is exponentially easier than the jump from 5% to 60%. The hard work, the time-consuming infrastructure-heavy phase, is already complete. Enrichment is not linear, it's cumulative. Each stage builds on the previous one. Once a state reaches 60%, the so-called breakout time shrinks dramatically. Now Tehran says it will suspend enrichment. But in physics terms, suspension means almost nothing. Centrifuges are not light switches. Inside facilities like Fordow, rotor assemblies spin at supersonic speeds, tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, separating isotopes with microscopic precision. These machines operate in cascades, interconnected in complex configurations designed for maximum efficiency. If you pause them, the machines remain intact, the cascades remain configured, the feed systems remain installed, the infrastructure remains ready. To Washington, a pause is not verification. It is a promise. And promises, in this context, are liabilities. That's why the U.S. negotiating team is demanding something far more radical. Physical dismantlement. Not storage, not sealing, not monitoring. Destruction. Rotor assemblies destroyed. Cascades disassembled. Key components rendered unusable, because sealed equipment can be reopened in days. Destroyed equipment takes months, sometimes years, to replace. Iran has categorically refused to discuss physical dismantlement. For American negotiators, that refusal is not a detail. It is the deal breaker. The command, anytime, anywhere. The second fault line is access. Under the 2015 nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, the International Atomic Energy Agency had access to declared nuclear facilities. But declared sites are rarely where secrets live. What inspectors did not have was unrestricted access to military facilities, particularly those controlled by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is not a peripheral actor. It controls ballistic missile development. It controls underground bunker networks. It oversees some of the most sensitive strategic programs in Iran. The civilian government negotiates. The IRGC holds the keys. Iran's new 78-point proposal offers enhanced monitoring of sites already declared. More cameras, more seals, more reporting, but nothing close to what arms control experts call anytime, anywhere inspection rights. That phrase is simple but explosive. It means inspectors can demand access to any facility, military or civilian, without delay. And that is something Tehran has always rejected as a violation of sovereignty. Washington sees a structural deception. As one U.S. official reportedly described it, it's inspecting the living room while the weapons are in the basement. Without access to IRGC-controlled sites, verification is partial. And partial verification is strategic blindness. The technology, environmental sampling. The third demand is the most technically fascinating and the most politically explosive. The United States wants deployment of advanced environmental sampling systems. These are not ordinary sensors. They are ultra-sensitive detection networks capable of identifying trace uranium particles at parts per quadrillion levels. We're talking about the ability to detect a single atom of enriched material drifting through the atmosphere, kilometers away from its source, using atmospheric modeling and collection systems. In practice, this would make covert enrichment nearly impossible within its monitoring radius. Even microscopic leakage leaves a fingerprint. This system would not rely solely on physical inspections. It would rely on physics itself. But here's the complication. Such a network would also map underground facility structures in extraordinary detail, ventilation patterns, heat signatures, particle dispersion routes. Iran has labeled this proposal espionage infrastructure. And strictly speaking, they're not entirely wrong. It is verification, but it is also intelligence. For Washington, that overlap is acceptable, even necessary. For Tehran, it is a red line, and that's where the talks are breaking. Because this gap is not about compromise. It's about capitulation. One side must accept intrusive transparency, or the other must accept strategic ambiguity. Neither appears willing. The geopolitical so what Now zoom out, because what happens in Geneva does not stay in Geneva. On the eastern Mediterranean horizon sits the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. It was initially deployed as a deterrent signal, a reminder that the United States retains overwhelming force projection capability. Deterrence is theater, presence is messaging. But that posture may be changing. Defense analysts tracking the group's positioning say it is transitioning from symbolic presence to operational readiness, what the Pentagon internally calls an enforcement mechanism configuration. That phrase matters, because enforcement is not about warning, it is about action. The Shadow Fleet. Iran moves approximately 5 million barrels of oil per day despite sanctions. It does this through a vast maritime workaround often referred to as the Shadow Fleet, a network of aging tankers, flag of convenience registrations, ship-to-ship transfers in open waters, AIS transponder manipulation, GPS spoofing. For years, this gray zone system has operated in a space too ambiguous for outright interdiction. But a carrier group and enforcement posture changes the calculus. Maritime interdiction becomes viable. Boardings become possible. Sanctions enforcement becomes kinetic adjacent. That gray zone narrows. And once enforcement begins, escalation risk multiplies. The pre-kinetic phase. If Geneva ends without a joint communique, if midnight passes without agreement, Washington enters what strategists are now calling the pre-kinetic phase. This is the space between diplomacy and war. Cyber operations intensify. Financial pressure tightens. Energy flows are monitored more aggressively. Naval movements become less symbolic. It is pressure without bombs. But it is pressure that can easily spiral. Because in this phase, miscalculation is the greatest danger. A misread radar signature, an intercepted tanker, a drone shot down, a cyber attack traced incorrectly. Each move narrows the ladder of de-escalation. The 10-day clock. And that's where the 10-day clock comes in. It's not official policy. It's not written in doctrine. But inside strategic circles, it's understood as the window between diplomatic collapse and irreversible escalation. 10 days to signal resolve, 10 days to attempt back-channel stabilization, 10 days before economic enforcement risks crossing into confrontation. After that, the available tools shrink, and the tools that remain are the ones no one wants to use. Airstrikes, missile exchanges, regional proxy activation. The Middle East does not need another ignition point. Global energy markets do not need another shockwave. But geopolitics does not wait for comfort. It moves when constraints break. The hard truth. This negotiation was never just about uranium percentages. It was about control. Control of infrastructure. Control of information. Control of escalation. The United States wants physics-level certainty. Iran will accept optics-level monitoring. Between those positions lies a gulf wider than any negotiating table. And when physics and politics collide, physics usually wins. Final question. So here's the question. No one in Geneva can avoid. If verification requires dismantlement, if access requires sovereignty concessions, if technology requires intelligence exposure, then what exactly is left to negotiate? And if nothing is left, what happens when the 10-day clock hits zero? If you want deep strategic breakdowns of the power plays shaping our world, the hidden mechanisms behind the headlines, subscribe to Hidden History Vault. Because history isn't just written in treaties. Sometimes it's written in the silence before midnight.